Hi BookTube, it's Amy. It's a rainy day here. I've got a fresh cup of tea in a mug that's fairly new. It's a very autumnal mug. It says, "Hello pumpkin." Not sure how I feel about the text on the mug, but I do like the fact that it's orange, it's got a pumpkin, and it definitely has a fall feel. Fresh cup of tea, just red rose orange pekoe. Too hot to drink. But hopefully by the time I finish reading this next chapter of A London Book Window, it should be cool enough for me to consume. So let's flip our way to the next chapter here, titled Lives of Great Men, and I shall read aloud to you as usual. Every book has a history before we see it. Certainly every notable book, just as a child lives before it is born. Nothing that is created takes being instantly, for creation, with its poetic mystery and beauty, is the nearest we get to divinity. You remember reading in Uncle Tom's Cabin about Topsy who just growed. It was a wise saying, lightly said, for nearly everything that matters just grows and cannot be forced along by artificial measures. Thus it is that the journals and magazines which climb to real influence and deep-rooted prosperity are mostly those which spring modestly from a root of personality, not from mere money power. With such thoughts as preface, for always we speak of books, may I tell you perhaps from unusual inside knowledge, the story of the two most notable political biographies of our time, that of Gladstone and that of Beaconsfield. The curious thing is that, though they are so recent, they take pride of place among our English political memoirs. What had we in the way of authorized official memoirs about Pitt or Chatham, Fox or Burke, Peel or Palmerston? Nothing that took classic rank, and only with the passage of years and an independent detached studies did those figures of English public life come into their due. We have had John Morley's Burke and Sir George Otto Trevelyan's Fox and Lord Rosebery's brilliant Pitt and other monographs which will readily occur to the well-read man. They made up, in a measure, and that was all, for the absence of any English political biographies comparable in interest with literary memoirs like Boswell's Johnson or Lockhart's Scott or Trevelyan's Macaulay. But now we have a Gladstone and a Beaconsfield, both works of the first importance, having regard alike to the long parts played in English history by their heroes and by reason of their literary quality. No doubt this quality is richest in the Gladstone, for was not its author one of the modern masters of English, and moreover he had a more varied and therefore a richer personality for his subject. But both books definitely remedy what had been a grave defect of English political biography on the former model, its sacrifice of style and form, color and character to mere material. You can almost hear the old biographers saying to themselves, "Here's lots of stuff, papers, letters, diaries. Pile them together, fling them to the printer, and let him do what he likes with them." It was not quite so bad as that, but generally what an old-time student got was a mass of raw records, through which he had to wade as best he could, instead of those records crushed into a living portrait. There we were, far behind the French political memoir, which always sought the soul of a man or a woman, though, as a whole, our literature is perhaps richer in biography, as it is in poetry, than that of France. Be inspired, Gladstone once said, with the belief that life is a great and honorable calling, not a mean and groveling thing that we are to struggle through as best we can. If he saw life on that noble plane, it was fitting that his own should be written on the same plane, and it was. However you regard him, he lived an epic, and clearly there was nobody who could express it so simply, so sincerely, so knowledgeably as his dear friend and colleague, John Morley. J. Morley, he wrote somewhere in the diary he kept, is on the whole about the best stay I have. And it was true posthumously as well as in the political fray. Hero and author between them went to the making of a book which would still have been irresistible, even if it had not, in the broad sense, been an authoritative political history of modern England. But what were John Morley's feelings when, having accepted the call of the Gladstone family to write the book, he went to Hawarden, I'm assuming that's how that's pronounced, Hawarden, H-A and then Warden, Hawarden, to survey the materials for it. He probably wished himself back in his own quiet, ordered London steady, where everything was familiar because he was confronted with an untold treasury of Gladstoniae, which he had to rifle for the essentials. It was a task that only a brave man of letters, giving up years in self-sacrifice, could face, and John Morley did that and triumphed. To him, writing was always an affair of the recluse, something that called him away from the world, an art which he could only follow as he only would follow it in solitude. When, with 2 helpers, he had mastered Gladstone's mountain of literary remains, he sat down at his desk every morning, except Sunday, at 9 o'clock. He went on all the day writing, sometimes slowly, sometimes rapidly, always with his severe test of quality anchored beside him. He wrote with his own hand the whole of the Gladstone, except the absolute letters and quotations given in it. And if you would like to know what that means, get the book and count its words. And so I haven't seen this biography of Gladstone, but I'm going to assume it is a very, very hefty book based on these comments here. Your task would be spoiled if I were to tell you roughly how many there are, and that would be a pity. No wonder there is a charming story which tells just how John Morley felt when, at the end of 3 years of a literary toil, rare in any annals, he finished the Gladstone. He was asked by a friend over at Andrew Carnegie's hospitable table at Skibo Castle in Scotland, "Aren't you glad it's done?" And he answered, "Yes, I'm very glad and very lonely." He had his reward, as most worthy tasks, undertaken with a single heart, are rewarded, for the biography in its 3 handsome red-clothed volumes was a far-flung success. Everybody read it, and within a few years of its publication, it had sold 117,000 sets, representing 271,000 volumes in the English and American editions, and people had spent over £100,000 on its purchase. Sad is the story of good books which have failed to find their readers and their fame, but there could hardly be a more exalted joy than to write a good book and have the world seal it so. Why did the Gladstone succeed so highly? Why does it remain, as it always will remain, a very living book? Because it tells the life story of the biggest personality England has known for long, because of the affectionate hold he had upon the hearts of the people, because of his wide range of interests from politics to theology, from poetry to finance, whereby he touched every book reader somewhere, and finally because John Viscount Morley himself, a first-class statesman and more than a first-class writer, was the biographer. What is the moral behind this? For a moral should always be drawn when, for certain, it can be found. The moral is that the world, which is equally full of curiosity and sympathy, the desire to understand and the wish to do honor, will always respond to the great thing which a great man may make of life. That is a Morleyism, and the Gladstone is full of lovely thoughts set in simple, beautiful language. Such is the language which wins those who like style as well as the man, but equally, if without consciousness on his part, it wins the man of the street. He reads with his heart as much as with his head, and it is this, no doubt, that keeps him wise in his choice of books. For does not Robert Burns, who knew the man in the street long before the phrase had been coined, tell us, "The heart's eye, the part eye, that makes us right or wrong"? It was a Welsh miner, poor but ardent in reading, who, when he finally managed to buy the cheap Gladstone, wrote, "Once I had the loan of the original edition over the Sunday from a library, and I devoured it for 48 hours without a stop. That incident touches the heart, and a test of the pocket, less winning though it be, will also betoken the achievement of the Gladstone." One day in March 1856, the Longmans sent Macaulay a cheque for £20,000 on account of the profits of the 3rd and 4th volumes of his History of England. This has been the record book cheque of the English literary world, but if the royalties paid by the Macmillans to the Gladstone family on the Gladstone were expressed together, they would make a far larger cheque than Macaulay's. When one says that, one adds an explanation that the rights of the biography belong to Gladstone's family, who gave John Morley £10,000 for his writing it, and later a second recognition and thanks offering of £3,000. We do not have such full details, literary material of the Beaconsfield, as had been set down around the Gladstone, partly because the stories of the two books are so different. All the conditions were right for the almost immediate ongoing of the one book, while the other was held up in a most disconcerting way. The consequence was that the Gladstone came out, as it were, with a bang, while he was fresh in the minds of a generation to whom he had been the grand old man. On the other hand, the Beaconsfield drifted unwritten over the years until those who knew him in life had passed away or grown old, for he died as his beloved Hewden in Buckinghamshire in April 1881, and the last volumes of his biography have only recently appeared. Somebody has said, wittily, and therefore not necessarily truly, that he left all his papers to his famous friend and secretary, Monty, Corey Lord Rowton, because in such safekeeping they were pretty certain never to be published. Certainly he could not have done that, because we do not find him writing in contrary Fleming. Read no history, nothing but biography, for that is life without theory. Monty Corey, whose entitled name, christened Rowton House, which he founded, was not in any manner a literary man, and Dizzy would hardly have expected him to do the biography. Simply he was left all the papers to handle as he judged well towards a biography. Only those concerning public affairs were not to be drawn upon without the consent of the sovereign. Here comes in the gain which time gives a book and fullness of material, as against its loss in the passing of the contemporary generation, and the two ways are admirably illustrated by the Beaconsfield and the Gladstone. What Lord Rowton did was to arrange Dizzy's papers, or have them arranged, but the years flew and the question, keenly discussed from time to time, remained, who's to write the life? A well-known London conservative journalist, the late Mr. T.E. Keble, was mentioned because he had been on very friendly terms with Disraeli. Other likely biographers were thought to be Lord Rosebery and George Wyndham, both admirers of Benjamin as a character, and both brilliant writers, as their books amply assure us. Nothing, however, had happened when Lord Rowton died in 1903, and all the papers then passed to the Beaconsfield trustees, the late Lord Rothschild, the late Mr. Leopold Rothschild, and Sir Philip Rose, who succeeded his father, Dizzy's friend and lawyer, as one of the executors. We must do something, said Lord Rothschild, who was the active trustee, and one morning he asked Mr. Morley Bell, well known as the then manager of the Times, to find the right biographer and have the life written and published. He in turn invited Mr. W.F. Moneypenny, a tried member of the Times staff, to undertake the work, and eventually the invitation was accepted. Mr. Moneypenny, whose health was not strong, died after getting out 2 volumes, and he left the basis of a chapter on the Tancred for a 3rd volume. It happened that Mr. George Earl Buckle, at that time, and for long editor of the Times, had, as an advising friend, read Mr. Moneypenny's volumes in proof, and so knew about the whole business from the inside. When therefore he resigned the editorship of the Times, he had the leisure and the will to complete Mr. Moneypenny's biographical task, and he did so with great ability and warm acceptance. Altogether, the Beaconsfield had run to 6 volumes, or twice the number of the Gladstone, though that circumstance does not certify the actual difference of length in the books. Dizzy reaches the crown of his career in the last 2 volumes, for they tell of the famous purchase of the Suez Canal shares, and of his return from Berlin, saying he bore peace with honor. They also include what only became available at the last moment, a budget of letters written by Dizzy after his wife died, to an English lady of quality. He was a man of sentiment, and those exquisite and curious letters continue and complete his sentimental journey. It took in Mrs. Bridges Williams before and after he married her, and there are epistles which tell that, in his great gallantry, he did not exclude Queen Victoria. But then Dizzy knew that half the intellect of the world and 3/4 of its heart are really the jewels of womanhood. And so there we have a chapter on 2 biographies that Milne felt were great in his day, and it is interesting that he says these are going to be around forever. They're going to stand the test of time. And I have never heard of either of these biographies. In fact, I have no idea who Beaconsfield is. And the only reason I recognize Gladstone is because there is indeed a street in Ottawa named Gladstone. And I would assume the street is named either after this man or some sort of relative of his, someone else who is big in politics on the Canadian side of things. But there we have it, a chapter on biographies. And I've read several old biographies, but I think it's somewhat a trait of the past for biographies to stretch multiple volumes. Now, in most cases, they try to cram everything they can about the person into a single volume, and it's usually only older biographies or biographies written in a more traditional way that stretch multiple volumes. For instance, there are several biographies of former Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau that stretch to 2 or 3 volumes, which is quite unusual. But I guess that's one aspect of the past that has sort of faded in literature, this idea that biographies would be multiple volumes. But anyway, I will see you again next week with a chapter titled Byron and the Murrays. And let's see, is my tea cool enough? The tea is perfect. The tea is perfect. A perfect rainy day to sit in a chair and read.